So this is our last video about the fundamentals of economics. And so really in this one, we're going to talk about the three major ideas of macroeconomics and the indicators that we study when we talk about the whole economy. And those are employment, price levels, and output. Okay, so how much stuff you're making, how many people are working, and what's the overall level of prices in the economy. So we're going to start with the employment one. A lot of words on here. I'm going to try to summarize these in the notes for you. The labor force is the first term to know, and in the United States, there's about 160 million people in the labor force. That's not critical that you know the number. It just kind of gives you a ballpark. It's about 55 to 60% of Americans are in the labor force. And that means that that is the people who are employed plus the people who are unemployed. That's all that is. Now, people who are employed are working for pay, In the last week, they worked for money. And then unemployed means you're not employed, to be clear, and you're looking for a job, looking for work. So you can't just not be employed. Like a retired person would not be employed, but they're also not unemployed because they're not looking. So unemployment is a really specific, actually, definition, and we call it the U3. It's just numbered. They have numbers because they're like there's U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, U6. The one that is the headline number is U3, but there are three things that go into that requirements, and you have to have all three be true to be unemployed. The first is listed there: no paid work in the last week. No paid work in last week. And so if you did, even if it was for 1 hour, if you were cutting somebody's grass, you're actually not unemployed. Number two is you have to be able to work, and this means 16 and over, not in prison or the military, and I'll talk about that in a second, the military or school. Now, the military is important here because when we talk about employment and unemployment, we usually say civilian employment, because when these statistics were developed, it was actually during World War II. And so what government officials needed to do is figure out how many civilians can be working. So we exclude military. We also exclude people who are in prisons and in school full-time, and we exclude people who are under the age of 16. The third thing to the unemployed, so you have to be all those two, and you have to have looked actively for work, in the last 4 weeks. Now, what happens if you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, but you looked 5 weeks ago? You're not unemployed. You're just not. You're not in the labor force, technically. You're not employed. You're not unemployed. Too bad, so sad. So you can see that there might be some problems, right, with the way we calculate this. And it's not the way we calculate it, it's maybe more just that there's shortcomings with just using U3 to reflect the reality of the economic conditions of a country. Okay, so three issues that are not like, hey, you know, we shouldn't use U3, but it's more like things to consider when we talk about unemployment. Number one is that it disincludes, or it discludes, it does not include what we call discouraged workers. It doesn't include discouraged workers. And these are people who are not employed and who stopped looking because of bad job prospects. So in other words, if you were not looking for a job right now in the pandemic because there aren't any jobs available, you're not technically unemployed, you're discouraged, right? And so there is another calculation that includes these people, but you could see how we might count the number of actually unemployed people, because if you gave up looking and you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, then you're not unemployed. There's another one, discludes what we call marginally attached. Right? That's that's my bad high school. Yeah, and marginally attached. So marginally attached means that they are not employed and stopped looking for any reason. Stopped looking any reason. And that includes all of the discouraged people, right? But it could be maybe you stopped looking for a job because you got sick or you had to take care of somebody. It may not be bad job prospects, but maybe because you could get a job, but you don't want to because you're afraid of the pandemic, right? That would be marginally attached. So you're not looking currently, you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, so you're marginally attached. It also doesn't include part-time or underemployed workers, right? And so there are people who would prefer full-time work, but maybe they're only getting 10 hours a week. And that's a real economic hardship for people, but we wouldn't say they're unemployed, right? You're worked for 1 hour, so you're employed. Everything's good, except you're only working a few hours, and it's really hard to do that on a minimum wage job. So some of the other measures of unemployment, right, U4, U5, U6, they actually include these. And so I encourage you to play around with Fred and look into them. The goal, right, thinking about what's the goal for unemployment, it's actually not zero, not 0%, but something called the natural rate. And there is a natural rate that we'll explore later in this class, but we could say it's usually between 4 and 6% in the United States. And the reason we wouldn't want zero is, think about it like this. If we said that the goal is zero, then you could never quit your job. You could never graduate from college without having a new job lined up already. You would never have any kind of people saying, you know what, you're fired, you're just not a good fit for us. You couldn't do that if the goal was zero. So you want to have a little bit of unemployment, a little bit of churn. And the normal or natural rate is between 4 and 6%. So I'll show you, actually, here's a graph showing you what that looks like. So here's the unemployment rate for about a 10, 12-year period. You can see that during the 2008 recession, it got really high. It went all the way up to 10%, the official unemployment rate, right? That doesn't include discouraged workers, marginally attached, or part-time workers. That's a lot of people who are looking for work at one time. And you can see that it was ticking downwards throughout these kind of last few years here, 2016, 2018. And oh, by the way, I've included the natural rate here. You can see that it kind of varies, but it's usually about 5%. And then the pandemic here. So you can see 14.7% is incredibly high. In fact, that's the highest unemployment rate since we started tracking the numbers. Now let's take a look at price levels. These are a second idea of economics that we concern ourselves with, and this is the idea of all the prices of the goods and services in the whole economy. So it's kind of averaging them out, right? Not just the price of a donut, but the price of actually 82,000 different products that are commonly purchased by households in the United States. And so there's a few terms to know. The first is, so I'm going to say change in price levels is what we're really concerned with. And the first is inflation, and that's simply an increase in price levels, right? Fairly straightforward, a positive change. And deflation is a decrease in price levels. It's actually a negative change. So we would say, like, if from a year ago, prices are negative 2%, what they were a year ago, that's deflation. So we actually can say, like, negative 2% from a year ago would be deflation. And if it were like positive 2%, that would be inflation. Okay. Two other words to know: nominal. Nominal. If you ever see that word, it means that it has not been adjusted for inflation. So you may have heard old folks say sometimes, oh, going to the movies was only a quarter back in my childhood. Well, that's nominal, right? If you adjust that for the fact that prices of all the goods and services in the economy have increased over time, then the real prices, right? So nominal, not adjusted. Real means they've been adjusted. Means they've been adjusted to take into account inflation, adjusted for inflation. And so that's what that one means if you see nominal and real. And we almost always will use real in this class because, after all, you know, Grandpa, I get it. Gasoline was 10 cents a gallon back in 1953. But you know what, Gramps? If you adjust that for the fact that people weren't earning that much money back then and everything was cheaper back then, the price of gas in the 1950s was actually pretty close to where it was this year. There's your fun fact. It's basically the same price. Now, there's one last word to see, and that's here, disinflation. Let me kind of use my pointer here. Disinflation is not the same as deflation. We're going to talk about that one more later. Disinflation means the rate is falling. So I'll just put that over off to the side. Disinflation means maybe you went from 3 to 2, right? You went from positive 3 to positive 2. It's a decreasing rate, but it's still positive. The goal is a steady kind of low level of inflation, not zero. Again, that goal is not 0%, but instead steady and low. And so we would say usually, in fact, the Federal Reserve targets a positive 2% inflation rate. Later on in this class, we'll explore a little bit more why we wouldn't want zero. But so here is the CPI. Actually, I wanted to show you a graph. You can see that it bounces around about 2%. Some years it's much higher. Here in 2008, it was like 5% for a little bit there, but then it was negative for a little bit there, but it bounces around the goal of around 2%. Okay. Now, output, the last one here, and this is the dollar value of the goods and services produced in a year or a time period, in a year or a time period, or whatever you want to say there, okay? And we actually usually measure it as the growth rate. We would say, what's the percent change in this value, right? So if we were to look at it from a year ago, are we 10% higher amount of output or 5% lower, and that sort of thing. In the previous video, we already talked about recessions and expansions. So we could just say they're decreasing output and increasing output, but we already know what those are. The goal is increasing, right? We want increasing output. We want more stuff. Technically, a healthy developed economy is usually around 2% a year, 2 to 3%. That's a really pretty good growth rate. If you get 3% a year, then that actually means your economy would be doubling roughly every 25 years, a little bit under that, right, in size. It'll double every 25 years. If it's 2% a year, then it doubles every 36 years. And so thinking about, how long the doubling time is in terms of the size of the economy can kind of be helpful there. I want to show you one last graph, but other than that, that's it in terms of notes. But if you stick around, I'll show you this graph here. You can see here the percent change in real GDP, right, on Fred. And we could see that in most years over the last 20 years or so, it's been about 2 to 3%, right? We bounce it around here, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. Look at that really nasty 2008 recession. It went down 8%. That's huge, right? That's the worst recession since World War II. You can see there 8.4%. That's really bad. Pretty close to this one in the 1980s, 8% there, and then one back in the 1950s that was 10%, but that was a really short recession, and it bounced back really fast. But you can see the bouncing back didn't happen after 2008. It was pretty difficult for a lot of people in these years. We saw that with the unemployment numbers. But I did want to show you, of course, the pandemic. It makes things puts things into perspective. It's an incredible decrease in GDP. We've never seen anything like it. So hopefully you've taken some good notes over here, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.